Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
First of all today, the monthly inflation figures for the UK have been released this morning. That's the Consumer Price Index, which measures the rate of increase in the prices of goods and services. And according to the Office for National Statistics, it has remained at its 5-year high of 3%. Which means there's no let-up in the cost of living squeeze hitting UK households, although the rate has not risen higher, as predicted by some economists. Well, let's talk now to our own economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, who can tell us what that means. So, Kamal, has it peaked inflation?
Well, certainly there seems to be some evidence that the foot has come off the inflation accelerator. I think that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, the sterling effect. So the decline in the value of sterling after the referendum meant that the goods and services we imported into the UK became more expensive, and that pushed up inflation. Because inflation is a comparative number, it is compared with what is happening this time a year ago, that inflation effect starts to fall out of the data. So sterling, although it's low, is staying at the same low rate. So that inflation effect is starting to dissipate a bit. And also oil prices aren't rising as fast, or fuel prices aren't rising as fast as they were this time last year. And the big question, as you suggest, is does it mean we've hit the peak? I think we are starting to see the top of that upward curve, certainly, and the Bank of England believes that the peak will be reached by the end of the year. There are still some inflationary pressures. Food prices are at the highest they have been since 2013. Unrest in the Middle East, global growth, increasing demand has meant that oil prices are starting to push up again. So although, yes, for the moment, the inflation has eased, whether or not this is quite the peak, I don't think it's quite the peak yet, so it will increase a little bit more. But the overall trajectory is starting to come down, certainly.
Right. Well, let's pick up on two of those things you mentioned. Food prices, for example. So, you know, your supermarket shop is still more expensive than it has been in recent times. And also wages, obviously, are still not keeping pace with prices. Absolutely.
So average household income increases are around about 2.2%. If you look at food inflation, that's running at 4.2%. So exactly as you say, that squeeze on people's living standards continues. Food is the largest proportion of our weekly expenditure, and certainly for poorer households, it's more significant than for richer households. The issue I think you're starting to see is you had this big increase in input inflation into the food system, into supermarkets. They suddenly had to pay a lot more for the food that was imported from the European continent in particular and elsewhere because of the weakness of sterling. Those prices are starting to be pushed through the system and starting to come out the other end, so to speak, in food inflation. That means it's tougher when you're looking at your Christmas spend, for example, on food. Now, again, because of this sterling effect, those effects might start dissipating over time. But that fuel price increase, some suggestions now that fuel prices will start rising again by the end of the year, and that will start pushing up those inflation numbers.
Right, and just briefly, what about reaction from the Bank of England? We saw interest rates double, obviously from a very low bar, but I've seen this strange phrase, the Bank of England will stretch out the horizon over which it plans to rein in inflation. Does that mean that it's not going to take any further action for the moment?
I think for the foreseeable future, that's absolutely correct. Many economists say there won't be another interest rate rise until the end of next year, and that interest rate rise will be of that very small number, 0.25%, once again. I think the Bank of England is not just concerned with inflation, where the pressure seems to be coming off slightly, but is also concerned with economic growth. And the real problems are in economic growth, not in inflation. So I think that this will encourage those dovish members of the Monetary Policy Committee, that's the committee that sets interest rates, to say we need to hold off any further interest rate rises, and will weaken the hand of the hawks who think that there should be more interest rate rises to control inflation. Today's figure, I think, means that any interest rate rise, when it comes, is a long way off and will be very small.
Kamal Ahmed, thank you very much. Claire Gerarda in the public sector, and if you look at the NHS, NHS. I mean, talk about busting the 1% pay freeze, which will be welcomed. But with inflation at 3%, it's not as much of a rise. In fact, in real terms, it's still a cut.
It's still a cut, but I think more importantly, where I sit with the NHS, more or less all the medicines I prescribe are from overseas, whether they're from Europe, China or America. And I wonder how much we've seen the inflation, the health inflation impact of what's going to happen if we don't have sensible trade deals post-Brexit. And I know we're going to be discussing Brexit later on in the show. But for me, the big worry is the health inflation costs and what that means. And of course, that will feed into our overall economy because we need medicines, we take them for granted, but they are very, very expensive. And if they're going to cost more because we don't get proper deals, then I think you'll see inflation rise even more. I'm not an economist, I'm just a simple punter in all of this, but I do see and read the newspapers and think, well, actually, we're in a very precarious position.
Now, there's been an unexpected pause in inflation. Instead of going up again, it's remained steady at 3%. Although food prices have risen, that's been offset by a fall in the cost of fuel. But prices are still outstripping wages, and the economic squeeze here is in sharp contrast with continental Europe, which reported strong growth figures this morning. Here's our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi.
Right now, it feels like the UK is stuck on a slow train, pulled back by high inflation and Brexit nerves. Over in continental Europe, it's a very different picture, with the economy racing forward.
Today's growth figures have come in better than expected from Europe. Even Italy is picking up speed. But here in the UK, we're just chugging along as consumers face a bigger squeeze thanks to higher inflation.
And while figures out today show inflation holding at 3%, that's still at the top of the government's target range, with rising food and drink prices the main problem. The result for families is an extra £144 a year for their grocery shopping. And it's not just consumers feeling the pressure. The inflationary pinch is making life hard for companies too.
Our labour costs are going up on around 6% per year. A lot of our chemical prices are going up well ahead of inflation. We have one chemical that's going up as much as 65% this year. And these are prices that we simply cannot afford to keep absorbing.
Graham Birchall says his family-run factory in Suffolk will have to start passing on prices next year.
If the business can't maintain its profitability, then at some stage in the future, maybe not next year or the year after, but at some stage, the business will fail. And clearly that means, yes, people will be laid off. Because we've got, issues on all directions. We've got issues, obviously, with Brexit and the uncertainty that faces. I think as a business, in 27 years, we've probably got more issues facing us now than we have done for a long time.
Just as the boss is feeling the squeeze, so too are his workers.
I've noticed cereal going up and also the cost of butter rising recently.
Is that a big deal to your family finances?
When I have 3 children, they all want separate cereals. Yeah, that can be quite expensive.
Apparently households now spend £144 extra a year at supermarkets. Do you notice that?
It is getting expensive. You expected to spend a bit less than what you spend it in a shop. So you was like, where did they go?
What's underpinning this is a deeper malaise that is weighing down on the UK economy. We may be at almost full employment, but workers don't feel like they can demand a wage hike. And companies like this one, which has already seen its costs go up, still don't think that the UK consumer is strong enough to accept higher prices.
One bright spot for cash-strapped spenders was furniture, which according to the Office for National Statistics actually got cheaper in October. Together with falling fuel prices, sofas managed to keep inflation out of the danger zone. But that's little consolation for those who have seen their salaries stagnate for a decade, now made more acute by inflation's sting and the relentless instability brought by Brexit.
Helia Ebrahimi reporting.
Right, ahead of next week's budget, the demands for cash are already landing on the Chancellor's desk. Today it was head teachers calling for more investment and college chiefs urging an end to the cuts. Mr Hammond's own Tory colleague Jacob Rees-Mogg has also issued his own alternative financial manifesto, claiming there'd be a huge dividend for Britain if there was a hard Brexit. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, has been to Mr Hammond's constituency in the home counties to find out what they want from the budget.
I got a smoky burger.
The Red Lion pub in Philip Hammond's Surrey constituency, but there's no downtime for him here. Just a week away from his crucial budget speech, even the landlord has a list of demands. Business rates are rising, and that, says the owner, isn't just hurting him, but the whole economy.
We've had big increases over the past few years. If I look at my small business, compared to last year, if the Chancellor doesn't do something about rates, I'll be paying £80,000 next year compared to £65,000 last year. It's a very big increase, very hard to sustain. I think it's a terrible thing to have town centres will die off and people won't come into town centres. I think that would be terrible.
The plea for a business rates freeze would cost the Chancellor more than £1 billion. But there are demands too for housing, as much as £50 billion under one radical plan. The NHS has asked for an extra £4 billion, while lifting the public sector pay cap would cost at least £6 billion. And the list goes on. It's easy to see how Mr Hammond's treasured pot of reserves could very quickly be drained.
There's no doubting next week's budget is a big fiscal and political moment. Mr Hammond is stuck between those in his party who want him to maintain discipline, to stick to his financial targets, and those who are urging him to do something radical around housing, the NHS or business rates to get the economy and his party back on track.
He's borrowed less this year, and in theory that should give him some room to spend. But productivity, the great driver of wealth, is sorely lagging. That will hurt future growth forecasts and eat into any reserves he does have. That doesn't stop them asking, though. Today, head teachers descending on Parliament to call not just for fairer funding for schools, but higher pay for teachers too.
It is very important because we can't recruit and retain teachers because of salaries, we end up needing to go out and use recruitment agencies to recruit, and that can cost you £6,000 per teacher. So that's a crazy waste of money. So we do need pay to be sorted out.
And then there's the Brexiteers who, when Mr Hammond stands up in the Commons next week, want him to prepare for a no deal by doubling his contingency funds to £500 million. But the group of economists led by Leave MP Jacob Rees-Mogg said the fiscal freedom of Brexit would boost the economy by £135 billion. With so many demands upon him, the Chancellor knows he can't please everyone. This budget, more than ever, there's an expectation of goodies emerging from that little red box. But they don't call him Spreadsheet Phil for nothing.
Back here now, and there was no let-up last month in the pressure on all of our purse strings. For the second month in a row, inflation was running at its highest level for 5.5 years. The October figure of 3% may be slightly lower than expected, but inflation on groceries is far outstripping that, with the cost of food and soft drinks up 4.1%. It is, of course, putting a further squeeze on household budgets, especially as wage increases are lagging behind at just 2.1%.
It's the time of year when retailers bank on us spending big. But rising prices are putting pressure on household budgets. Food prices in particular are hotting up, and the Woodford family is feeling it.
Baby food in general has gone up quite a lot. We feel like we're doing a lot more hours at work to pay for the same things that we were paying for a few years back that weren't quite as costly then. We can't go out as much as we used to as well.
Christmas is make or break time for supermarkets and other retailers, and yet this year many of their customers will be feeling that money's pretty tight. The price of many everyday essentials is on the rise. Vegetables cost almost 6% more than they did a year ago. The price of milk, cheese and eggs has risen almost as sharply. Electricity bills are 11% higher. However, in the last month, the cost of filling up the car fell slightly, holding the headline rate of inflation in check, although well above target. At New Forest Ice Cream, they're preparing for the festive season, but inflation is eating into this company's profits.
We call it our gold bullion, our little bad boy.
The price of the most important ingredient, double cream, has almost tripled. The company doesn't think customers are willing to pay more, so it has taken the hit.
Do you see any sign that the worst is over?
It's plateaued off. I think it has got better, but I can't see it coming down as quick as it's gone up.
Much of the higher inflation we are experiencing has been imported. The slump in the value of the pound that followed the referendum on the EU last year has made the stuff we're shipping in more expensive. Now, the good news is there are signs that pressure is easing, but the bad news is some economists think the squeeze on living standards will continue.
The Resolution Foundation calculates that lower future productivity growth means the UK is looking down the barrel of the biggest squeeze on earnings since HMS Victory sailed in the Napoleonic Wars.
It is expected by 2022 we'll still be about £30 a week worse off than we were before the financial crisis. And this is really unprecedented.
The glad tidings are that inflation may be peaking, but it doesn't necessarily follow that we'll end up feeling better off in the months to come.
And Joel is back from Portsmouth, as you can see, and joins me now. Joel, you just talk us through the broad overview on this then.
Well, broadly, prices, Tom, are rising faster than pay, and in Portsmouth in particular, the pinch is being felt quite keenly. Portsmouth and Southampton are part of the Solent economic region, and if you look at what's happened to household income, it's actually fallen over the last year by more than 2%. Now, that's also the case in Cumbria, in Cambridge, in Peterborough, in Cheshire, in Warrington, and in Buckinghamshire. And the Resolution Foundation, Tom, as you saw there, calculates that at the beginning of 2008, as the financial crisis began, average weekly pay stood at about £544 a week. Today, it's actually lower than it was then, £31 a week lower. Higher inflation has diminished household spending power. Now, inflation is expected to fall, but the Resolution Foundation is forecasting that even in 5 years' time, it will still be lower than it was back in 2008. An extraordinary, remarkable, almost unprecedented squeeze on household income, the worst we've seen for 200 years.
But hold on a sec, if you say inflation's falling, why is the squeeze going on?
Because weak pay growth will persist, and it will persist, Tom, because productivity growth will remain weak. Now, 2 weeks ago, the Bank of England said that it thought Britain's productive potential has been permanently damaged by the financial crisis in 2008. We're not sure. It's flatlined ever since. And that's at the core of our prosperity. It's a remote idea. It's a subtle idea. It's one that leaves most people cold. But you'll be hearing an awful lot about this because it's a problem for us as a nation. If we want higher pay, we've got to boost productivity. It's a problem for the Chancellor too. He's banking on tax revenues that may never appear in future. Watch what he has to say next Wednesday when he delivers his budget.
OK, a very important budget, and we will see that's the budget next Wednesday, which we will, of course, be covering here in great detail. Joel, thank you very much for now.
Well, look, let's move on to the business side. We had car companies in front of a committee of MPs today, Helen. What did they have to say?
Well, so the headline grabber was Aston Martin, and they talked about a no-deal Brexit being, in their words, semi-catastrophic. And what they mean there is that cars built in the UK are certified here by the UK regulator, and that certification is valid overseas, it's recognised overseas. What they're saying is in an acrimonious no-deal Brexit, they might have to shut down production and find another means to be certified. So that was the doomsday stuff. Right. But as you said...
Yes, there were some numbers as well.
Exactly. The numbers which sort of illustrate the challenge of planning. Honda, big top 5 car maker, 40% of its components come from the EU. So that's 2 million components every day arriving on 350 trucks. And that's just-in-time manufacturing. Honda only keeps 1 hour's worth of stock in Swindon at its factory, just 1 hour. So they're thinking about how much more stock do they need, where do they store it all, how do they cope with delays. And again, they're talking about a 15-minute delay, maybe meaning £850,000 in extra costs. And they think it would take them 18 months to be ready to leave the customs union and to deal with the extra customs volume. So an insight there just into some of the complexity around this.
And what they're saying. OK, well, before we can move on to long-term trade deals, any of that, we have to the dice has to throw a 6 so we can get past go, which means getting out of these divorce talks, Nick. And now, tell us what is going on there and what we're expecting tomorrow.
Well, Theresa May is going to be love-bombing the European Parliament over the next week because, of course, they do have to approve this deal. And tomorrow she'll be meeting Manfred Weber, who's the leader of the largest centre-right group in the European Parliament, crucially a member of Angela Merkel's party. Now, today, Mr Weber said he did not believe that there would be a deal in December that would allow these negotiations to go on to the next stage because, of course, what are they saying? The UK's put 20 billion euros on the table. It's got to be 3 times that amount. Interestingly, though, today, William Hague, in his Daily Telegraph column, did say that the government should put a larger sum on the table because he said it would unlock those talks on the future, on the transition. Why do we take him seriously? Not just because he's a former Foreign Secretary, but in that very column earlier this year when Theresa May was saying no early election, he said early election.
OK, so maybe we should go and read him. Nick, Helen, thank you both very much.